This is the lecture that accompanies Chapter 2 for Intro to Sociology. It's Part 2. In Part 1, we started to talk about variables, those factors that can be manipulated. And I gave you an example involving whether or not someone's poor health had some kind of a link with someone's poor income. So I gave you those two factors. Then I suggested to you that there's ways we can look at these factors, call them variables, and then look to see how one may relate to the other. So that if we manipulate the independent variable, by definition the thing that we can change, we'll look to its effect. If someone's income improves, for example, we can measure that improvement by the improvement in the health of the person. So that describes two simple variables, but as you can imagine, things aren't necessarily simple all the time. We might have moderating variables, which have some relationship between the dependent and independent variables, and that it ends up affecting the underlying relationship. So we may talk about a moderating variable such as economics, that in some parts of the country it's very difficult to find a job, so that while it may be true that if you improve income you could improve health, the difficulty may lie in being able to improve income. So that would be an example of a moderating variable. A mediating variable may be something that is between the independent and dependent, but does not necessarily affect the relationship between them. So it may be that we don't have a problem with regional variation within employment, that location doesn't really change. So location might be a mediating variable. It could be something that has an effect, but in that particular instance it doesn't have any impact. So consider that to be a mediating variable. When you're in the process of preparing some kind of a research, you may end up trying to figure out how things are done. And to test a hypothesis, that is, an educated guess on whether or not the theory is correct or not in a particular instance, you may need to operationalize what's going on. The idea of operationalization is a kind of an approach or method for measuring a term being examined for use in a particular study. So the idea of operationalizing might be like with the example between income and health. The theory might have stepped back and said that there's a link between one's economic status and one's physical well-being. The operationalization process then would look at income and then measure a potential change with the subject's health. So that's the process of operationalization. When it comes to conducting research, there may be several questions involved. One has to do with the concept of validity. That is, in effect, that the dependent variable is measuring something that is meaningful. If you end up looking at something that is not meaningful, your research may be invalid. It may not necessarily end up giving you any insights at all about the validity of the theory. So when we look at validity, we're making sure that what we're measuring is something that is in fact what we want to measure. In the example with income and health, we may look at income in a number of different ways. Perhaps it's easier to measure it on the basis of annual income. On the other hand, you may end up wanting to measure it in terms of the intervals at which a person gets paid from a particular employer. But in either instance, you're talking about measures that are valid, that end up giving you insight on a change in one's income, so that you'll be able to see that there's a change in one's health. Another concept relates to reliability. That has to do with the idea that you'll be able to take the results from one type of research and move it to another type of situation to get the same results. Finally, generalizability has to do with the notion that your research has meaning beyond the scope of your experiment. So let me give you an example of how these factors are working, and I'm going to end up doing it in terms of a famous experiment from the realm of criminal justice. A question that had dogged criminal justice researchers for years was to try to understand the effect or impact of policing on the crime rate. So research was done in Kansas City. You'll recall I talked about this in class. We had 3 neighborhoods where the crime rate was being measured. Neighborhood 1, we increased the patrolling presence. Neighborhood 2, we decreased the patrolling presence. And neighborhood 3, we didn't change anything about the frequency of patrols. These 3 neighborhoods were roughly similar. The importance of that, of course, has to do with the fact that if we are able to manage all other aspects of our research, an experiment, we'll feel more confident that any changes that we detect among the neighborhoods is because and only because of the frequency of patrolling. If you'll recall from what I said in class, over a span of a year, there was no statistically significant difference in the crime rates in those neighborhoods. Yes, there was some variation, but the variation could not be seen as something that would be accounted for by the frequency of patrolling. So when you look at an experiment like that, reliability means that you should be able to set up a similar experiment, say at the other end of Missouri in St. Louis. Do the same thing, find 3 similar neighborhoods, vary the frequency of patrolling, and with any luck, you should get results that are roughly the same. In terms of generalizability with that particular study, what you may find out is that other types of presences may not matter. So you might want to measure, for example, in a hospital, the frequency of checks by medical personnel and the degree to which that can have an impact on the quality of health care. So if the Kansas City experiment suggests that to a certain extent the degree that you could end up varying the frequency of monitoring has no change or impact on things, maybe then the results are generalizable. Next, the author wants to talk about the experimenter, the role that the experimenter may have in the process of conducting research. The idea of experimenter effects is well known. Here the author talks about it as a white coat phenomena. That is where you have a situation that the presence of the researcher is believed to have caused the change itself, not necessarily that there is a change due to whatever you're studying. A very famous example of this comes from the 1920s, and this involves the same phenomena under a different name called the Hawthorne effect. Research was being done at a manufacturing facility, the Hawthorne facility, in the early 1920s. The hypothesis that a change in light could end up affecting the production rate in this facility. People were told on the manufacturing line that they were being studied, and so you ended up seeing the researchers varying the levels of light and looking at the outcomes. To the surprise of the researchers, it didn't matter the condition of the light, more or less changing the output. And so from that, it seemed reasonable to conclude that because people knew they were being watched, they ended up trying to compensate, in the particular example, for the change in light. So I think this is another example of the white coat effect that the researcher is talking about. It gets much worse, perhaps, if you think about something in a classical experiment. Let me talk about briefly classical experimental design to illustrate another instance where the white coat effect is something that could happen and a strategy for being able to minimize the impact of the white coat effect. While we talk about sociology and studying people, experimentation is done in many different fields. For example, when you look at the field of pharmacology, you're trying to study medicines that are going to improve the human condition. There's a process by which we investigate the effectiveness of various types of medicines in this country. The idea behind the process is to ensure that only items that actually could make a difference are finally released to the public. So what we first see is that perhaps it is a business that ends up manufacturing pharmaceuticals, discovering that a compound does have an effect on a particular disease. At least when you put the compound in a test tube with examples of the disease, perhaps it's carried in infected blood, you end up seeing that the compound eliminates the factor or the presence of the disease. The second step involves testing this material on a live subject, an animal subject. So we may end up seeing that the disease is present in an animal and then in some way transmit the new chemical and study the health of the animal. The final stage involves human subject testing. Understand that by going through 3 stages like this, the process ends up winnowing out those medicines that looked promising but in fact could not demonstrate their validity, that they in fact were something that we'd want to pursue. But the problem with human subject testing is that humans are clever enough to understand if they're being tested. Again, call it the white coat effect, call it the Hawthorne effect, but in any case, when people understand that they're being observed, the results may be skewed. So how do you get around this? What you end up doing in a classical experimental design is taking a large population and dividing it into 2. First, the thing that you need to do with these populations is select by random the groups, because with any luck, that may minimize the effects of something like people who come to a study who know one another, perhaps are related by blood or law, so that random assignment might be one way to diminish the possibility that that linkage or association will skew the results of the experiment. Next, of those 2 groups, you're going to have one group that gets the medicine and the other group that is not going to get the medicine, only they won't know it. Rather, the medicine will be in a particular form, like a pill, as will be a pill that contains no active ingredient, called the placebo. The placebo will be given to the control group, and the experimental group is going to be the one that gets the new medicine. Just like we saw with the Kansas City experiment, it's important to have a control group to know that, in fact, the group that is the experimental group, the change in the quality of their health is a result of the medicine and only the medicine. What's rather confounding is that you will find people who receive the inert ingredient in the placebo actually getting better, a phenomenon known as the placebo effect. A concept that, while it is recognized, may not be altogether understood. It suggests potentially that there is a linkage between the mind and the body that may mean there's a way of being able to cure or remedy a particular kind of influence based on state of mind. In any case, a final problem that's faced in trying to test with the control group and the experimental is the possibility that while the pills for both populations may be identical, that the person distributing the pills might know which one is the effective and which one is in fact the placebo. So the person who ends up actually distributing the medicines has to be somebody who doesn't know whether or not the pills being distributed are in fact effective or not. This elaborate process is known as a double-blind study, because it means that the people who are in the experimental group and the control group don't know whether they're one or the other. And they are not tipped off by the person who distributes the pills, if in fact what we're trying to do is test the effectiveness of a new medication. Getting away from that medical model, however, when it comes down to something involving sociology and other phenomena involving humans, we might instead look at reflexivity, the way in which the white coat effect does have an impact on a particular study. What we'll hope to do in trying to understand the phenomena better in circumstances that may not be like a classical experimental design with that medicine is to ask the researcher to look at the circumstances and conditions of what goes on. Earlier I gave you an example about somebody who is looking at the behavior of individuals at a bar. Perhaps the best way to be able to do this and to minimize the white coat effect is in fact to have our observer not wearing a white coat in a bar, which would indicate to some people that somebody is monitoring, so that the researcher ends up being as unobtrusive as possible. Perhaps the researcher takes notes surreptitiously or in some other way as not to tip off the patrons at the bar that the researcher is observing them. The idea behind this is to minimize the possibility that the presence of the individual skews the results. The metaphor that might describe this involves the concept of the duck blind. For those of you who go hunting, you may understand when it comes to duck hunting that you want to get as close to the ducks as possible when it comes to having them fly into the air so that you can shoot at them in close range. But as you can imagine, where ducks like settings involving water, if you start to approach the ducks, they'll see you. If you start to wade through water towards the ducks, they'll hear you. A duck blind is a kind of a camouflage set up ahead of time so that the hunters may end up being behind this blind, this screen, and the ducks will be oblivious to the fact that hunters are there. When the time comes to get the ducks in flight so that they can be shot, when that happens, the blind might be open so that the hunters now have an unobstructed view of the ducks and may be able to sight them and kill them as per their wishes. So there may be a way to be able to manage what's going on by trying to be able to disguise oneself in some way as to minimize the way in which people who are being studied would alter their behavior because they understood that they're being studied. The last thing to consider in this particular part relates to the difficulty of being objective. That is, to be able to record phenomena without necessarily having one's experiences color the interpretation or the recording of data. All this is, as you might imagine, easier said than done. The concern is, of course, is that the researcher may end up unconsciously filtering out certain information. If we have our researcher in the bar, in what way may the researcher be making decisions about which data to deal with or not? In a situation like that, perhaps we end up having a hidden video camera in places where that's allowed so that the person's observations can be seen as linking with, correlating to the activities that are shown in the video. But nonetheless, there can be a risk that no matter how objective a person aims for, some measure or element of subjectivity can creep in. If it's inevitable, and it seems rather likely, the trick then for the researcher to perform is to understand that some element of subjectivity can creep into the observations and to try to guard against that as much as possible. Let me stop here to end part 2 of the video lecture for Chapter 2.